Dirk noticed that Yu was upset about something and asked her what was wrong. She replied that she would be more downcast when rumours spread that the tycoon's son was now with an adopted girl. Dirk tilted his head and found it interesting. Yu looked at him questioningly. Dirk asked if he really looked like the biggest villain in the tycoon family, suggesting that maybe the girl was just crazy. Changing the topic, Yu asked if she had done something unnecessary that day. Dirk looked unsure and asked what she was talking about. Yu, flustered, clarified she meant the day at the hotel when they had drinks together. Dirk laughed, surprised that Yu probably didn't remember anything. He teased her, saying they were quite close that day. For example, Yu hugged him, left a kiss mark, and they even slept together. Shocked by his words, Yu hit the table and told him to stop. Dirk switched the subject, asking why she was eating so little and whether she had already eaten today. Annoyed, Yu told him not to change the subject and added that it was her food, so she knew better. Dirk acknowledged her point, but asked out of curiosity what kind of guys she liked. Yu, puzzled, said she had no preference and asked why he was suddenly asking. Dirk asked how he measured up as a boyfriend. Yu's eyes widened in surprise, and she asked him to clarify. Dirk said he was starting to like her a little, which is why he was curious about her thoughts. Receiving no answer, he asked again if she didn't have any thoughts about him. Yu stared at him, bewildered. Dirk continued, saying they were going to get married, and people usually marry someone they like. Wasn't that right? Yu replied that such things were a waste of time and bad for business, but it wasn't the only response he left to the article either. Dirk smiled sarcastically, expressing regret. He was even feeling a little nervous. He started tapping the table and began to mention that night again, but I cut him off sharply, telling him to stop talking nonsense. Dirk smiled, noting that he hadn't even said anything yet. Ben smiled too, noting that I hadn't even faltered. How was it that she managed to slip up too? Yu noticed that Dirk was staring at something on her hands. Looking down, she realized it was the strange inscription that appeared after death. Quickly, she covered it with her sweater sleeve, not wanting him to see it. She asked if he had noticed anything on her wrist. Dirk, puzzled, asked if she was hiding something. Yu averted her gaze and said it was nothing. Dirk, deciding to change the subject, asked if they could talk about something more important. Yu, serious now, said WJ Retail was about to fail financially, which was why Dirk needed a marriage with Yura. Dirk confirmed that he had insisted on the marriage as it would help him attract more investors. He explained that marriage was one of the conditions under which his grandfather would invest in the company and, if things went well, he could eventually control the company's shares. Yu smiled and revealed that she had already bought 5% of the shares and that they would sell out quickly as soon as WJ Retail's stock dropped. Dirk was impressed by her foresight, but noted that it might take 30 years to achieve that goal. Yu smiled again and said that's why she needed him, so he would invest in her company. Puzenia nochot kasmia vidlacha convenjus kovortsalenda games. Tucha considered whether WJ Retail was worth the investment. Yu promised that he wouldn't regret it. Tucha considered whether she wouldn't regret it. Tushon Talme, Yu uninterested in their games, refused. Yu, uninterested in their games, refused. Tucha continued that what they were doing wasn't much different from playing a game, where there was a 50/50 chance of getting caught. Yu, undeterred, confidently replied that they would succeed no matter what. Suddenly, Yu received a message saying the results of a requested DNA test would be known in 2 weeks. Yu was thrilled, but tried to hide her excitement. Dirk noticed her happiness and quietly said he was happy for her. Yu looked at him questioningly. He smiled, saying he liked her plan and encouraged her to keep trying. Doak stood up, and Yu realized her plan had failed. He mockingly told her that if she wanted to marry him so badly, she should propose. Yu shouted in disbelief, asking what he was talking about. Doak continued, saying that in that case they'd need wedding rings. No kissing, though. Yu, shocked, started laughing nervously, saying that since it was necessary for the marriage, she would do everything required. Doak didn't expect that response. Yu held out her hand and declared that it was a proposal. Later, Yu drove home, deep in thought about the mystery surrounding her grandfather's death and the transfer of the inheritance to Ura. She feared the suicide note was forged and resolved to uncover the truth. As soon as she entered the house, her stepmother slapped her hard, shouting at her for not answering the phone and worrying everyone. Rubbing her cheek, Yu realized she had been wrong to think this woman was her biological mother. Her stepmother, arms crossed, said that legally she was still Yu's mother, unless Yu had found someone else. Yu retorted, asking if it was okay for Ura to have an unlawful relationship with a man. Her stepmother was furious, unable to believe what she had just heard. Yu sharply grabbed her mother's hand, saying she knew exactly who she was. The stepmother who had raised her since she was 9, and Yu added that she would marry Du. Their conversation was interrupted by Yu's father, who came in and demanded that they stop arguing. He scolded Yu for how she was speaking to her mother. Yu, feeling betrayed, argued that she was his daughter too, but her father sternly told her she wasn't like Ura and expressed disappointment in her. Yu was devastated. Then, her stepmother, trying to calm things, apologized to her husband, taking the blame. The father left, telling Yu she'd be staying home for a while. Yu stood there, eyes downcast, feeling utterly defeated. The man, just as he was leaving, turned around and mentioned that she would be home for a while. Yu stood still, her eyes downcast, staring at the floor. The woman sighed softly and called for the 2 maids. As they approached Yu, one of them tried to remove the bag from her shoulder. Yu screamed, insisting she could do it herself. She then pulled her phone out of the bag, holding it out while warning the maid not to touch it. After this, Yu retreated to her room, and her stepmother smiled awkwardly at her outburst. Once inside her room, Yu shut the door behind her. The situation felt surreal. She hadn't thought she'd ever return to this place, yet here she was, driven by a new sense of purpose. She opened her drawer and began rummaging through her clothes, scattering them across the floor. Tying the shirts together, she approached the window, eyeing the height. It wasn't high, but it wasn't low either. Carefully, Yu began to lower her makeshift rope. At first, everything went smoothly, but then her foot slipped, and she plummeted toward the ground before she could grab hold of the rope again. Her eyes filled with fear, and for a brief moment, memories from her past flashed through her mind. The terrifying moment when she was hit by a car. She shut her eyes tightly, wondering if this was death coming for her again. Suddenly, a hand reached out, catching her before she hit the ground. It was the guard, who had luckily been nearby. Gently, he placed her on the ground, then looked at her intently and asked if she had been trying to escape. He added that if she truly sought revenge, she should stay in the house to achieve it. Yu looked at him, confused. Revenge wasn't on her mind. What did he know? The man adjusted his glasses, suggesting her actions weren't befitting of someone like her. Frustrated, Yu told him not to pretend he knew her or her motives. The man smiled and offered his hand. Yu's head was pounding, and she struggled to stand. She asked for her phone, and the man handed it to her, after asking what she planned to do. With a calm but determined tone, Yu replied, "To take revenge." He smiled knowingly and reminded her that he had, after all, advised her to stay. At that moment, the man pressed the intercom button and a voice asked who was there. Dog AIO greeted them, holding a stunning bouquet of roses. When Yu's stepmother opened the door, she was stunned. What he had said was indeed coming true. Dog AIO smiled warmly and asked if he could come inside. The whole family, except Yu, gathered around the table. Dog AIO apologized for arriving unannounced, but the father waved it off, assuring him that the article wasn't worth worrying about. Dog AIO smiled awkwardly, apologizing again, but the father confirmed he'd seen the article and noted that such things were published nowadays without real evidence. Dog AIO nodded, adding that sometimes it's necessary to get rid of something, even if it's the truth. The stepmother couldn't hold back any longer and asked if the article was indeed true. Dog AIO glanced around and asked where Yu was. The stepmother forced a smile and replied that Yu had left early that morning, but Dog AIO, sipping his coffee, wasn't convinced. The father reassured him that he had already spoken to Yu and everything was fine, but Dog AIO said the opposite, that he was the reason Yu had become involved. The room turned tense. The father asked what Dog AIO meant, and after a moment, Dog AIO confessed that the article was true. Meanwhile, the guard quietly stood outside Yu's room, working discreetly to pick the lock. After a successful click, he opened the door and told Yu it was time. She agreed, saying it was time to show her family who she truly was. She walked silently down the hallway, past the guard. The family was still talking with Dog AIO, but the stepmother spotted Yu out of the corner of her eye and became furious. How had she escaped the locked room? Yu looked radiant, her hair gleaming in the sunlight and her simple dress highlighting her figure. The conversation halted abruptly as everyone noticed her, except Dog AIO, who smiled and commented that Yu must have been there all along. The stepmother seethed, while the father only frowned. She left. Yu pulled out a chair and sat beside Dog AIO. They exchanged smiles, glad to be in each other's presence. Dog AIO then boldly announced that he wanted to marry Yu. The room fell silent. The stepmother and daughter were completely stunned by his declaration. When pressed, Dog AIO explained that he had no other choice but to marry for love, not for political gain. He glanced at Yu, reaffirming his intentions, and Yu's heart swelled with a mix of relief and disbelief. The stepmother, visibly shaken, objected, pointing out that Yu had recently been through a breakup and couldn't possibly be ready for a relationship. Yu's father agreed, suggesting it might be best for her to move on from recent events before rushing into anything new. Yu, now tense, lowered her gaze, unsure of what to say. Dog AIO took Yu's hand, promising to help her figure out what she truly wanted. He then stood, ready to leave, telling Yu they had reservations at a restaurant. Moments later, they were in his car, speeding down the road. Yu, still processing everything, asked him directly what his price was. Dog AIO laughed, reminding her that they had already discussed this. At the restaurant, Yu felt uncomfortable, not used to being treated so delicately in such a public setting. She distracted herself by scrolling through her phone, but when she opened a message from Sujan, she realized there had been no response. Her thoughts were interrupted when Dog AIO asked if she was going to eat. Yu assured him she was fine, but was clearly struggling to relax. When dessert arrived, Yu's discomfort only grew, her mind still elsewhere. After seeing the dessert, Yu's expression changed, and Dogok, noticing her reaction, looked a bit perplexed and asked if something was wrong. Yu began trembling uncontrollably, her mind drifting into a memory. In her recollection, a woman offered her the same dessert, smiling sweetly and urging her to open her mouth. Yu, surprised but trusting, told her mother that it tasted. She didn't get to finish her sentence. Her face twisted into horror and pain, and she collapsed to the ground, desperately calling for her mother, her hands clutching her throat as she coughed violently. Something was burning her throat. Frantically, she asked why the dessert tasted so strange. The woman, hovering over her, coldly asked why Yi called her mum, when she should only be addressed as auntie or ma. Snapped back to the present, staring in horror at the dessert in front of her, the memory of it being poisoned flooding her mind. That same woman had disliked her so much that she'd poisoned her. Dogok, still confused, asked again what she was thinking about. A little shaken, replied that everything was fine and turned her head to look out at the evening cityscape. Sensing the tension, Dogok commented that if she didn't want the dessert, he'd gladly eat it. Yu turned back to watch him, her eyes wide with anxiety. As soon as he took a bite, Yu's heart raced, her eyes fixated on him, waiting for something terrible to happen. But nothing did. Dogok smiled, swallowing his bite, and said if she was remembering something painful, she could share it with him. Yu was surprised by his words but touched. Few people ever showed concern for her like this. It was something entirely new for her. After a brief pause, Dogok looked around and smiled, saying this seemed like the perfect place to propose. He then asked if she had prepared the wedding rings and a kiss. Yu, taken aback, thought he was joking, but to her surprise, Dogok got up from his chair and knelt in front of her, wide, dark eyes fixed on Ben's plate. The colour was darkening around his cheeks as he pulled a small box from his pocket. "What are you doing?" she asked nervously. Dogok smiled, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring that sparkled under the dim restaurant lights. "I'm making a real proposal," he said, his voice calm yet serious. Dogok then asked, "Will you marry me?" Before she could fully process what was happening. The ring was already on her finger. Suddenly, Yu asked if Dogok knew she was a zobik, someone who avoided kissing for hygiene reasons and had a strong aversion to uncleanliness. Dogok, taken aback, laughed and asked, "What about the evening we had?" Yu, feeling a little flustered, brushed it off, saying it was just business. Dogok smirked, leaning in and teasingly said, "Well, since it was just business, then..." Before he could finish, Yu grabbed him by the shirt, interrupting him, and declared that since she hadn't proposed, she had prepared a kiss instead. She pulled Dogok close and kissed him gently, standing on her toes to reach him. Dogok's bewildered expression softened as he began to enjoy the moment. Their lips, once inseparable, finally parted. Embarrassed, U stepped back, saying, "That's enough for now." But Dogok, not ready to let the moment end, pulled her back by the waist and kissed her again. The scene shifted to Dogok's office on a bright sunny day. Dogok was scrolling through the social news feed when suddenly he saw a photo of himself and Yu kissing. Did he really get caught again? Just then his secretary walked in and teased that the director had become a celebrity. Dogok jumped, startled by the news. The secretary went on, saying it was now official. The director was a public figure. Dogok sighed, understanding the situation. After a moment, the secretary asked if Dogok wanted him to handle the article, maybe even asking Sujan, the reporter, to delete it. Or should he, jokingly, cut off Sujan's middle finger as a warning? Dogok tensed at the second suggestion, saying the first option would do just fine. At that moment, a notification popped up on Dogok's phone. It was a message from Yu asking him to have lunch together. The request left Dogok speechless. Yu? Inviting him to lunch? Without hesitation, Dogok responded that he'd be happy to join her. His heart raced as he turned to his secretary seeking advice. "If a girl invites you to lunch, doesn't that mean she's interested?" he asked. The secretary, pondering, cautiously replied, "Probably." Dogok, unsure, pressed further. The secretary finally relented, adding, "As your brother-in-law, I'd say don't get your hopes up too soon." Dogok, a bit taken aback, laughed nervously. Dogok was leaving his office, heading toward the exit where Yu was supposed to be waiting for him. As he walked, he told himself it would be best to avoid drawing too much attention. Suddenly, he heard someone calling out to him. Thinking it was Yu, he lifted his head with a smile, only to find Yuru standing in front of him, smiling brightly. She began walking towards him, and as she did, memories flooded back. In the past, a younger Yu stood off to the side, scuffing the ground with the toe of her sneaker, watching her sister Yuru from afar. Yuru had wanted to approach her, to reach out, but she had barely taken a single step when their mother pulled her back. The woman gestured toward the vast estate around them, telling Yuru that everything she saw now belonged to her. Then, pointing to the lonely Yu, she coldly remarked that Yu wasn't real, unlike Yuru, who was the real one. It wasn't the first time their mother had said something like this, and each time she would ask Yuru if she understood. As Yuru walked toward Dogok in the present, she thought about all the things her mother had said, how they were, in a way, true. She had everything, the real things. Now, here she was, standing right in front of Dogok, who was clearly surprised by her sudden appearance.